The chapel at Gildenmere had been cold since dawn, and by the hour appointed for the wedding, the cold had soaked into the stone so deeply that the candle flames seemed to lean toward the mourners rather than the bride. They were not mourners. They were the first families of the county gathered in their best to watch a duke marry an heiress, and they had arranged their faces into the small, bright expressions that such occasions required. Yet the light made them grave. It fell through the tall east window in long bars of gray and gold, and it caught the bride at the chancel step, and it caught the duke, who had turned to receive her. And for one suspended moment, the whole of the gathered county held its breath without knowing why. He had not meant to look at her hands. A man looked at a bride's face, at the veil, at the careful triumph of her gown. And the Duke of Gildenmere was a man who did what was expected of him with a discipline that had become indistinguishable from his nature. The heiress, though, had been told to remove her right glove for the giving of the ring, and she drew it off too slowly, as a person does who has rehearsed the gesture and still distrusts it. And the bare hand came into the bar of window light, and the Duke looked. What he saw stopped him as a wall stops a horse. Not revulsion, recognition. The hand was smooth, white, soft as a hand that has never held anything heavier than a fan. It was a beautiful hand, and it was the wrong hand. And the wrongness of it went through him like cold water, because for 1 full year he had carried in his breast pocket a small engraved miniature, and he had studied the work of it 10,000 times, and he knew, the way a man knows a voice in the dark, that the hand which had cut those lines had been a working hand. He did not yet understand what he understood. He only stood very still, and the priest waited, and the ring waited in its little dish, and the Duke said, in a voice that carried to the last pew, that he could not proceed. You may think you know why a duke stops a wedding. Stay with this one. The reason was not what any soul in that chapel supposed, and the truth of it had been sitting in plain sight, in a pair of hands, for longer than anyone had cared to look. To understand the mourning in the chapel, you must go back 11 months, to the wet end of Ewechsham autumn, and to a young woman who was not an heiress, and had never expected to be mistaken for one. Her name was Linnea Druitt, and she was 24 years old, and she had spent the better part of her life at a sloped wooden bench in a narrow shop on Marazion Row, learning from her father the trade that the gentry bought and never thought about. Eldred Druitt was an engraver. He cut copper for printers and silver for the great houses. He set fine letters into the backs of watches and the lids of snuff-boxes, and he taught his only daughter to hold a graver as though it were an extension of her own wrist, because his eyes had begun to fail and her eyes had not. She was good. She was, in truth, better than her father, though neither of them said so aloud. For to say it would have been to acknowledge how much the shop had come to depend on a girl whose name could never appear above the door. The fine portrait work, the miniatures cut into oval plates no larger than a thumbnail, the steady patient cross-hatching that made a face seem to breathe in metal, all of it had passed to Linnea's hands by the time she was 20. Her hands showed it. The right thumb wore a hard pat of callus, where the graver pressed. The fingertips carried the faint gray shadow of metal that no soap could quite lift, and the skin across her knuckles was reddened and dry from the acid baths in which the plates were bitten. They were not soft hands. They were hands that had made beautiful things, and the making had marked them, and Linnea had never once been ashamed of that until the day she was taught to be. The teaching came when her father died. He died in the spring, quietly, with a graver still in his coat pocket, and the shop on Marazion Row passed by the cruel arithmetic of the law to a cousin who knew nothing of the trade and wanted only the lease. Within a month, Linnea had been turned out of the only rooms she had ever known, with her father's tools wrapped in oilcloth, and her mother's worn miniature in her pocket, and very little else. A woman alone, skilled in a trade that no respectable house would let a woman practice under her own name, had 2 roads before her, and both of them led down. She took the only door that opened. She went into service as a lady's companion because she could read aloud and write a fair hand and hold her tongue, and because a clergyman who had pitied her father wrote her a character. That was how Linnea Druitt came to the household of the Maugrays, and to the side of Miss Séverine Maugrey, who was an heiress, and who was about to become the most important person in Linnea's narrow life. The Maugrey fortune was new, which is to say it was 3 generations old, and still spoken of in certain drawing rooms as though the ink were wet. Séverine's grandfather had made it in shipping, and her father had polished it into land, and Séverine herself at 21 had been raised to understand that the fortune existed for one purpose, which was to buy her a title. She was handsome in the way that money makes a woman handsome, with glossy dark hair and a complexion kept pale and perfect by a discipline that never relented, and she had the particular confidence of a person who has been told since the cradle that she is the correct answer to every question worth asking. When she looked at Linnea, she saw a useful object, neither more nor less, and she said as much to her mother on the first evening, in a private aside that Linnea was meant to overhear, and did the new companion would do, Séverine said. She was plain enough not to draw the eye, and clever enough to be of use, and that was the whole of what a companion was, for Linnea folded the words away and said nothing. She had learned that silence was the one possession no one could take from her. What she could not have foreseen was the matter of the miniature. In the 2nd month of her service, Séverine received word that she had been all but promised by an arrangement between families to the Duke of Gildenmere. He was a widower, 36, who had buried a young wife 3 years before, and had not been seen to smile since. He was rich in the old way, land upon land, a name that went back to a time when the Maugreys had been cutting timber for other men's ships, and he was by every account a cold and exacting man, who had agreed to the match because his advisers had pressed him, and because he had stopped caring enough to resist them. The arrangement called for the lady to send the gentleman a token before their first meeting, as custom required, and Séverine, who could not draw, who could not sew anything finer than a clumsy hem, who had no accomplishment that was truly her own, found herself in need of a gift that would speak of taste and feeling. She set the problem before her companion as she set most problems, which was as a thing to be solved by someone else. There was a fashion that season for engraved portrait miniatures, small oval plates cut by hand and set into a case, and Séverine wanted one to send to the Duke, and she wanted it to be exquisite, and she did not in the least care how it was got. Linnea, who had her father's tools still wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of her trunk, made a mistake then that she would spend a year regretting. She offered to cut it herself. She told herself it was prudence. A commissioned miniature would cost more than her quarter's wage, and Séverine would have grumbled at the expense and remembered it against her. She told herself it was nothing, a small task, a way to be of use. The truth she admitted to no one, was that her hands had been starving. 11 months of folding shawls and reading sermons and pouring tea had left her fingers aching for the one thing they knew how to do, and when she unwrapped the oilcloth that night and felt the familiar weight of the graver settle into the old callus on her thumb, something in her chest that had been clenched since her father's death loosened all at once. She did not cut Séverine's likeness. That was the second thing she could not have foreseen mattering. Séverine wanted a portrait of herself to send, but Linnea had no skill at flattery and no wish to spend her nights studying that cold, lovely face. So she proposed instead a different subject, and Séverine, indifferent to anything but the effect, agreed. Linnea cut a scene. She cut a small garden under a half-moon, a wall with one gate standing open, a single bird on the wall with its head turned as though it had heard a footstep, and into the border she set a line of letters so fine they could be read only by candlelight held close. The letters spelled the fragment her father had been fond of, about the patient hands that make a thing outlasting the maker. She worked 4 nights on it, after Séverine had gone to bed. She poured her whole grieving year into a plate the size of her thumb. And then she gave it away, and the gift went out under another woman's name to a man she had never seen. That, then, was the seed of everything. A duke who had stopped feeling received in the post a small engraved garden, with an open gate and a bird that had heard something, and he held it to a candle and read the fragment in the border, and for the first time in 3 years something in him answered. He did not fall in love with an heiress, he fell in love with a pair of hands he believed belonged to her. He could not have explained it, and being a man unused to explaining himself, he did not try. He only carried the miniature in his breast pocket, and took it out at strange hours, and he agreed to the match he had been resisting, and he told his advisers, with the first warmth they had heard from him in years, that the lady who had made such a thing was a lady worth knowing. The whole machinery of the wedding ground into motion on the strength of 4 nights' work by a companion whose name no one in his house had ever heard. Now we come to the part you have been waiting for, and I will not hurry it because it did not hurry. When the Duke first came to Wexham to meet his promised bride, Linnea stood 3 steps behind Severine's chair, as a companion stood, and watched the cold, composed man come into the room. She had wondered, cutting his miniature, what sort of face would read those small letters in the border. She found that his face was harder than she had imagined and sadder, and that when he spoke in short, level sentences that gave nothing away. He bowed to Severine. He said the correct things. And then his eyes moved past the heiress to the plain young woman behind her chair, snagged for a half-second on her hands, which were folded and gloveless and unmistakably the hands of someone who worked, and moved on, because a duke does not study a companion's hands. And yet he had seen them. Some part of him had filed the sight away without knowing why, and through the long, strange months of the courtship that followed, that filed away knowledge worked in him like grit in a wound. The courtship was a careful performance, and Linnea was its hidden engine. Severine could not write a letter worth reading, so Linnea drafted them, and the Duke fell deeper into a correspondence with a mind that was not the mind he believed he was courting. Severine could not speak of the things the miniature had promised, the patient love of small-made things, so when the Duke turned the conversation that way, as he did with a hunger he could not hide, Severine grew vague and changed the subject. And the Duke went home, each time more puzzled by the distance between the woman in the letters and the woman in the chair. 3 times that autumn, Linnea sat by the fire after the household slept and wrote, in Severine's name, the truest things she had ever told anyone, to a man she was forbidden to address. She was not a fool. She knew what was happening to her, and she despised herself for it, and she could not stop. The Duke had a way of going still when something moved him, a stillness like the surface of deep water, and Linnea had begun to live for the moments when she could make that stillness happen, and then watch it from 3 steps behind a chair. It was the loneliest pleasure she had ever known. She told herself it would end with the wedding, that she would be sent away or buried in the great house's lower rooms, and that the ache would fade as her father's death had faded into something she could carry. She did not yet know that Severine had begun to watch her, too. For Severine was confidently wrong about a great many things, but she was not stupid, and she had seen the Duke's eyes follow her companion to the door, and she had read the letters Linnea drafted before she copied them in her own hand, and she had felt, with the sharp instinct of a woman raised to protect her position, that something in those letters belonged to the companion and not to herself. This was the danger she could not allow. Severine did not love the Duke. She wanted what he was. A woman does not need to love a man, however, to understand that he is slipping toward another woman, and Severine understood it, and she began, quietly, to build her defenses. Here is the part the chapel did not know. Severine went one gray afternoon to the bottom of Linnea's trunk, while Linnea was reading to the dowager, and she found the oilcloth, and she unwrapped the engraver's tools, and she understood at once and entirely what she was looking at. The callus on the companion's thumb, the gray shadow on the fingertips, the miniature the Duke carried, cut by no fashionable artist in town, but by the very hands now folding shawls in her own house. Severine stood a long moment with the cold gravers in her palm, and a single clear thought went through her, sharp as the tools themselves. If the Duke ever saw those hands and understood, the match was finished, and the title with it. So she set about making the truth impossible to prove. She did not destroy the tools, for a missing trunk would raise questions. But she took the oilcloth bundle away and locked it in her own dressing case, and she gave out that the companion had been caught pilfering and could no longer be trusted alone in the family's rooms, which served to keep Linnea always watched and never near her own things. She wrote in a careful copy of an artist's hand a false receipt from a fictitious miniaturist in town, dated and detailed, so that if any question ever arose about who had cut the Duke's treasured plate, there would be a name and a sum and a paper to answer it. She coached 2 of the maids, with coin and with threats, to swear that the young lady Séverine had sat for the portrait herself. She prepared, in short, for war, and she did it months in advance. And she did it well, because Séverine Maugrey had been raised to win, and had never once been beaten. This is what Linnea was up against, though she did not know the half of it. She knew only that her tools had vanished from her trunk, and that the household had grown colder toward her, and that a rumor of theft now followed her down the back stairs. She voiced no complaint. She had learned that a companion who complains is a companion dismissed without a character, and a dismissal would leave her with nothing at all. So she swallowed it, and she went on drafting the letters, and she watched the wedding draw nearer, like a tide she could not turn. It was the dowager who said the cruelest thing, and she said it without malice, which was worse. The Dowager Duchess of Gildenmere had come to Wexham to inspect her son's bride, and she was a woman who had spent 60 years inside the order she was now defending, and she looked at the world through it, as through a window she had never once thought to open. She found Séverine satisfactory, which is to say, rich and decorative and properly deferential, and she found the companion beneath notice, and one evening, believing herself unheard, she remarked to Séverine's mother that it was a mercy the companion was so plainly a drudge, since a prettier woman in that position might have given the Duke ideas. But no man of sense would look twice at a creature with hands like a scullery maid. Linnea was in the next room. The door stood open. She heard the word drudge settle onto her like dust, and she heard the older woman's certainty, beneath it the bone-deep certainty, that a hand which had worked could never belong to a woman worth choosing. And she went up the back stairs that night and did not weep, because weeping was a luxury, and she had given up luxuries when her father died. The next morning, the Duke came again, and this time, the thing that had been working in him since the first day came to the surface. He had asked in one of his letters that his promised bride bring to their next meeting the original drawing from which the miniature had been cut, for he wished to see her first sketches, the line before it became the line in metal. It was the request of a man trying to close the distance he could feel between the letters and the lady. Séverine had no drawing. She could not have produced one if her life had hung on it, and her life, in a sense, did. So she came to the meeting empty-handed and improvised, with the cool fluency of a practiced liar, that the sketches had been burned in the cutting, as was the artist's custom, and the Duke received this and said nothing, and Linnea, 3 steps behind the chair, felt the lie land and saw the Duke's stillness gather, and understood that he did not believe it. He turned in that gathered stillness, and he did a thing no one expected. He addressed the companion directly. He asked her in his level voice whether she had ever seen such work cut, whether she knew the trade at all. For he had a question about the depth of a line that the lady, he said with great courtesy, had not been able to answer. It was a trap, and it was a lifeline, and Linnea could not tell which. She kept her hands folded out of sight in her lap. She said in a voice she kept flat with great effort that she knew nothing of engraving, that she was only a companion, and the Duke looked at her for a long moment, and his eyes went to her lap where the hands were hidden, and he said quietly that he was sorry to have troubled her, and he let it go. He had not let it go, though. Linnea saw that he had not. She saw a man who had begun to suspect that he was being deceived about the one thing in his life that had made him feel again, and she saw that he did not yet know how. And she carried that knowledge up the back stairs and lay awake under it. Things moved quickly, after that the way they do at the end. The banns were read, the settlement was signed. Séverine, sensing the ground shift beneath her, pressed for an early date and got it, and the wedding was said at the Duke's own chapel at Gildenmere, 3 weeks hence, and the whole party removed there to prepare. Linnea went with them because a bride brought her companion, and she found herself walking the cold corridors of the house whose master she had fallen in love with through his letters, sleeping in a narrow room above the kitchens, watching the preparations for a marriage that was built root and branch on her own hidden hands. It was at Gildemere, 4 days before the wedding, that Séverine made her last and most dangerous move, and it was here that the antagonist showed her teeth. She had grown frightened, and frightened people in possession of power grow cruel. She summoned Linnea to her dressing room, and she laid the false receipt on the table, and the locked dressing case beside it, and she told the companion plainly where matters stood. She knew what Linnea was. She knew about the tools, the trade, the miniature, and she informed Linnea in a polished voice calibrated to wound, while remaining technically kind, that if the companion ever breathed a word of it, to the Duke or to anyone, she would be exposed before the whole county as a thief who had stolen into a great house under a false character and tried to ruin a marriage by claiming another woman's accomplishment as her own. There was a receipt, there were witnesses, there was a companion already rumored to pilfer. Who, Séverine asked with the small smile of a woman holding every card, would believe a drudge with stained hands over a duchess? This was the dismissive label voiced for the 3rd time, and it was the worst of the 3, because it came not as careless cruelty, but as a weapon deliberately drawn, and Linnea understood for the first time the full shape of the trap she stood in. To stay silent was to watch the man she loved marry a lie. To speak was to be destroyed, and worse, to be disbelieved, so that even her destruction would change nothing. She went back to her narrow room with the word drudge ringing in her, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and she took out her mother's worn miniature, the one thing Séverine had not found because Linnea kept it always on her person, and she held it the way her father had taught her to hold a finished plate, lightly, by the edges. So the work would not be marred by the warmth of a hand, and somewhere in that long night the last of her fear burned away, and what was left was not courage exactly, but the plain refusal of a maker to let her own true thing be claimed by a counterfeit. I want you to stay with her in that room, because what she decided there is the whole of the story. She did not decide to fight Séverine. She had no weapons for that fight. She decided something smaller and harder. She decided that she would not lie. If she was asked plainly, by the one person whose asking mattered, she would tell the truth and take what came. That was all. It was the only freedom left to a woman who owned nothing, and she took it. The morning of the wedding came gray and cold, as I have told you. The chapel filled, and Séverine was dressed in the triumph of her gown, and Linnea stood among the lower servants at the back in her plain gray, with her gloveless hands folded, because a companion had no gloves fine enough for a duke's chapel, and would not have presumed to wear them if she had. She watched Séverine go up the aisle on her father's arm. She watched the Duke turn at the chancel step, and she saw his face, the hard, sad face she had cut without ever seeing, and she made herself a small promise that she would not weep until the words were spoken and the thing was done. Then came the moment of the glove. The priest reached the giving of the ring, and Séverine drew off her right glove for it too slowly, as a person does who has rehearsed a thing she fears, and her bare hand came up into the bar of gray and gold window light, white and soft and perfect, and the Duke looked at it, and the Duke went still. Not the gathered stillness Linnea knew. A different stillness, the stillness of a man who has just understood something he has been refusing to understand for the better part of a year. He looked at the soft white hand that had never cut a line in its life, and the whole structure of the deception, the vague answers, the burned sketches. The lady who could not speak of the thing she had supposedly made fell into place behind his eyes all at once. And his face, which the county had not seen change in 3 years. He let go of the bride's hand. He said in a voice that carried to the last cold pew that he could not proceed. The chapel made the sound a chapel makes when 200 people gasp at once and try to swallow it. The priest faltered. Séverine's father came half out of his seat. Séverine herself stood frozen with the glove dangling from her perfect fingers, and across her lovely face passed for one unguarded instant the recognition of a woman who has felt her single best-laid plan crack beneath her. The dowager rose, demanding to know the meaning of it. And the Duke, ignoring all of them, turned from the altar and walked back down the aisle, past the staring families toward the rear of the chapel where the lower servants stood, and he stopped before a plain young woman in gray, with her gloveless hands folded before her, and he looked at last, and on purpose at her hands. He looked at the hard pad of callus on the right thumb. He looked at the gray shadow the metal had left in the skin, and the acid's redness across the knuckles, and the steadiness of the long, clever fingers, and Linnea, who had promised herself she would not weep, lifted her chin and let him look, because she had decided she would not lie, and to hide her hands now would have been the deepest lie of all. The whole county watched a duke study a companion's hands as though they were the only thing in the world. He took the miniature from his breast pocket. He held it beside her hands in the window light, the small moonlit garden cut in metal, and the same hand that had made it standing bare an inch away, and there was no longer any question to ask. He asked it anyway, because she deserved to be the one to answer. He said her name, not Miss Maugrey. Her own name, which he should not have known, and somehow did, for he had made it his business in the last desperate weeks to learn the name of the companion whose hands had snagged at him from the first day, and the sound of it in his voice, the first time any person of his world had spoken it as though it mattered, went through Linnea like the window light through the cold stone. "Linnea," he said, "did you cut this?" She could have saved herself with a single lie. The trap was still set. The receipt still lay in Severine's dressing case. The witnesses still coached, the rumor of theft still hanging on her like dust. A lie would have been safe, and a truth would be ruin. She looked at the small garden under the half-moon that she had cut in her grief 11 months before. The patient line her father had taught her, the fragment in the border about the hands that make a thing outlasting the maker. And she told the truth. She said, yes, she said it quietly, and she said it plainly, and she did not look away from his face when she said it. What followed was not the Duke's victory. And that distinction matters, for this was no rescue. The Duke believed her. In his heart at once, but belief in the heart settles nothing in a chapel full of people who have just watched a duchess-to-be humiliated, and Severine, who had not been raised to lose, gathered herself with frightening speed and went on the attack. She came down the aisle with her father and her mother behind her and the dowager's outrage at her back, and she did exactly what she had warned Linnea she would do. She named her a thief. She said the companion had stolen into the household under a false character. She said the wretched creature had clearly cut some clumsy copy to deceive his grace and worm her way above her station, and that there was a receipt, a proper receipt from a proper artist in town, to prove the true provenance of the miniature, and witnesses, 2 of them, who had seen the young lady sit for the portrait with their own eyes. It was fluent, and it was vicious, and it was on its face entirely believable, for everything in the room agreed with it. A duchess's word against a drudge's. Stained hands against soft ones. The whole weight of the order the dowager had defended all her life came down on Severine's side of the scale, and for a long, terrible moment the scale held there, because the Duke's certainty was not proof, and the county's faces had begun one by one to turn back toward Severine, toward the safe and ordered version of the world in which heiresses do not lie and companions do not make miniatures that break dukes open. Linnea felt the room turning. She had told her truth, and the truth was losing. Exactly as Severine had promised it would, and she understood that her own worth, the thing she had poured into the plate, was about to be voted down by a chapel full of people who could not imagine it. Then Linnea did the one thing only she could do. She did not argue. She had no gift for argument, and no standing to argue from. She asked instead, in her flat, careful voice, for a graver and a small plate of soft metal. Any scrap of silver, the back of any snuff-box in any gentleman's pocket. She said she would settle the question of who had cut the miniature in the only way it could honestly be settled, which was to cut, before them all, the same hand at the same work, and let the room judge whether a drudge could make such a line. It was the dowager of all people who gave her the means, and she did it to expose the companion, not to save her. The old woman certain that no working drudge could match a true artist's plate, and that the test would unmask the impostor in an instant, drew the small engraved case from her own reticule, a thing she had carried 30 years, and she set it down hard on the chancel rail and bid the creature prove her insolence or be silent. A young groom named Holland, who had liked the quiet companion and disliked the cold heiress, produced a graver from the stable kit, the rough tool used for marking harness brass, and pressed it into Linnea's hand. And Linnea, with 200 of the first families of the county watching, and her whole life balanced on the next quarter hour, sat down on the chancel step in her plain grey gown, and she steadied the dowager's silver case against her knee, and she began to cut. The chapel went utterly silent. There is a thing that happens when a person does in front of strangers, the one thing they were truly made to do, and it silences a room more completely than any argument. Linnea's stained right hand, the hand the dowager had called a scullery maid's, settled the graver into the old callus on her thumb, and it stopped, trembling, and it became the steadiest thing in that whole cold chapel. She did not cut a portrait, for there was no time. She cut into the corner of the dowager's silver case, the same small bird she had set on the wall of the Duke's miniature, the bird with its head turned as though it had heard a footstep, and around it in letters so fine they could be read only by leaning close, she cut a maker's mark, her own initials. The mark her father had taught her to set into the corner of every finished plate so that the world would know whose patient hands had made the thing. The same mark, did anyone but look, that stood in the corner of the Duke's miniature, where it had stood for 11 months, too small for soft-handed people to notice. She held the case up. The Duke took it. He held the dowager's case beside his own miniature, in the window light. The two birds, the two marks, cut by the same hand a year apart, and he turned, and he showed them to his mother first, because the cruelty had come from her, and the correction should reach her first. The dowager looked. She was a woman of 60 who had spent her whole life inside an order that told her a working hand could not belong to a worthy woman, and she looked at the proof of it cut into her own silver, the fine, impossible line, the mark that matched the treasure her son had carried over his heart, and something in the old certainty went out of her face. She did not crumble. There was no ruin in it, no destruction, for neither Severine nor the dowager was the sort of enemy a true reckoning needs to break. The old woman simply lowered herself onto the front pew, and she looked at the stained hand that had just made a beautiful thing under her own eyes, and she said, in a voice gone suddenly small, that she had been wrong. It was the first time in 60 years she had said it. She said it once, and she meant it, and it was enough. Severine's receipt died in her hand. A forged paper cannot stand against a line cut in living metal before 200 witnesses, and the two coached maids, seeing the case turn, melted back into the crowd and would swear to nothing now. Severine stood alone in the triumph of her gown, with the whole structure of her winning collapsed around her. And her lovely face worked, and for an instant Linnea, who had every reason to hate her, felt instead the strange pity one feels for a person whose single weapon has failed her. Severine had been told her whole life that she was the correct answer. She had never been taught what to do when the world declined to agree. She gathered the rags of her composure, and she said one broken thing, that she had only ever done what she had been raised to do. And there was a terrible truth in it. And then she turned and went out of the chapel by the side door, displaced and corrected but not destroyed, which was all that mercy permitted and all the morning required. Then the chapel was quiet, and the Duke turned back to the woman on the chancel step, and the last distance closed. He knelt down on the cold stone, which a duke does not do, so that his hard, sad face was level with hers, and he set the miniature in her stained palm, the small garden and the open gate and the bird that had heard a footstep, the thing she had made in her grief and given away under another woman's name, returned now to the hand that made it. He said that he had fallen in love with a pair of hens a year ago, and had spent a year courting the wrong woman in the dark, and that he had understood the truth the moment the wrong hand came up into the light. He said it plainly in his level voice, with no speech and no flourish, the minimum a man could say and still say everything. And then he asked her, not as a duke asks anything, but as a man with nothing certain in his hands for the first time in years, whether the woman who had written him all those true letters in another's name would consent to write the rest of them in her own. Linnea Druitt looked at the miniature in her palm and at the man kneeling on the stone before the whole staring county, and she did the bravest small thing of her life, which was to believe that she was worth the choosing. She closed her stained fingers around the little garden. She said, yes. She said it as plainly as she had said the first yes, and this time she let herself weep a little. Because the thing was done and the words were spoken, and no one could take them now. They were married in that same chapel 6 weeks later, when the banns could be read fresh and properly under her own name, and it was a quieter wedding than the first, with fewer of the first families and more of the household. And the groom, Holland, stood near the back, looking pleased with himself, and Mrs. Quilby, the housekeeper, wept into her apron, and the dowager sat in the front pew and watched her son marry a companion and said nothing unkind, which from her was a kind of blessing. Linnea wore no fine gloves. She had decided, in the narrow room above the kitchens where she had once lain awake under the word drudge, that she would never again hide her hands from anyone, and she gave the Duke her bare stained hand at the altar in the grey and gold light, and he took it as though it were the rarest thing in the county, which he had come to understand it was. There remains the matter of how it ended, and it ended fully, with no question left hanging in the cold. The Duke had a room at Gildenmere, fitted out as a workshop, a south-facing room with the good clear light a maker needs, and he had Eldred Druitt's tools brought up from the locked dressing case where Severine had hidden them and laid clean on a sloped wooden bench, the oilcloth unwrapped at last, the gravers in their order. He did not ask his Duchess to give up her trade. He asked her to teach it to him. Badly on winter evenings, his big, careful hands ruining plate after plate while she laughed, which she did now having relearned how. The miniatures she cut in the years that followed went out into the world under her own name and her own maker's mark, the same mark she had cut into a dowager's silver on the worst and best morning of her life, and people who had never heard of Marazion Row paid handsomely for the work of the Duchess of Gildenmere, and the Duke kept the first one. The little garden, with the open gate in his breast pocket, still, though now the hands that had made it were across the breakfast table every morning, and he no longer needed a token to feel. On the last night, I will show you a winter night, with the snow coming down, soft past the workshop window, and the fire low and warm. Linnea sat at the sloped bench finishing a plate. A graver settled into the old callus on her thumb, and her husband came and stood behind her chair as he had once stood behind another woman's chair in another house. 3 steps back, watching her work. She felt him go still in the old way, the deep-water stillness she had first made happen across a Wexham drawing-room and had spent a forbidden autumn living for, and she did not have to turn to know his face. She held the finished plate up to the candle by its edges, lightly the way her father had taught her, so the warmth of her hand would not mar the work. And in the corner of it, small and fine and unashamed, stood her own true mark. The snow came down, the fire held, and the patient hands that had made the thing went on outlasting every cold morning that had tried to deny them. If Linnea's story stayed with you, I hope you will sit with it a moment before you go, and perhaps tell someone you love about the hands that made the thing. Thank you for staying until the end.